The battles around Rzhev, fought between January 1942 and March 1943, represented one of the longest and most brutal campaigns of the Eastern Front. Often overshadowed by the simultaneous events at Stalingrad, they became known among Soviet soldiers as the Rzhev Meatgrinder because of the immense casualties inflicted during repeated offensives and counteroffensives. To understand why this region, located roughly 200 kilometers west of Moscow, turned into a killing ground for more than a year, it is necessary to examine the preconditions and context that made Rzhev strategically significant. The geopolitical background stemmed from the German failure to capture Moscow during Operation Typhoon in late 1941. The winter counteroffensive launched by the Red Army in December 1941 had pushed German forces away from the capital and forced them into defensive positions. However, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and later Günther von Kluge retained a salient extending eastward around Rzhev, Vyazma, and Sychevka. This Rzhev salient threatened Moscow directly and provided a potential springboard for renewed German offensives. For the Soviets, eliminating this bulge became a priority to secure the capital and restore strategic depth. National interests sharpened the focus on the region. For Germany, maintaining the Rzhev salient ensured pressure on Moscow and allowed for control over rail lines and supply routes vital for Army Group Center. It also provided a defensive buffer to protect the approaches to Smolensk and the rear of German forces further south. For the Soviet Union, reducing the salient promised not only relief for Moscow, but also the chance to destroy a significant portion of Army Group Center. The Soviet leadership under Joseph Stalin pressed the Red Army to launch continuous offensives in this sector throughout 1942, viewing it as a central theater even as battles raged elsewhere. Military preparedness on both sides shaped the coming struggle. The German Wehrmacht in early 1942 still possessed considerable strength despite the setbacks of winter. The Ninth Army, commanded by Colonel General Walter Model, was tasked with holding the salient. Model was known for his defensive expertise and was determined to turn Rzhev into an unbreakable fortress. His army included multiple infantry divisions, reinforced by armored units and heavy artillery. They constructed elaborate defensive lines with trenches, bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire, creating depth designed to absorb and then repel Soviet attacks. The Red Army, meanwhile, had achieved a morale boost from the defense of Moscow, but remained weakened by earlier losses. In January 1942, Soviet forces launched the Rzhev-Vyazma strategic offensive operation with the aim of encircling and destroying large portions of Army Group Center. This ambitious plan involved the Kalinin Front under General Ivan Konev and the Western Front under General Georgy Zhukov. Together they deployed hundreds of thousands of men, supported by armor and aircraft, against the German positions. However, coordination was weak, logistical support was inadequate, and winter conditions compounded difficulties. Intelligence assessments played a critical role. The Soviets believed the German front was far more vulnerable than it actually was, leading to overconfidence in the prospects of deep penetration. German reconnaissance, by contrast, identified Soviet buildups early and allowed Model to prepare countermeasures. The result was a series of Soviet offensives that collided with well-prepared German defenses, leading to enormous casualties for limited territorial gains. Public sentiment and propaganda also influenced the campaign's context. In Germany, the failure to take Moscow was downplayed, and holding the Rzhev salient was presented as evidence of the Wehrmacht's resilience. For the Soviet Union, Stalin demanded relentless pressure on the Germans to demonstrate to both domestic and international audiences that the Red Army remained capable of offensive action. The consequence was a campaign characterized by repeated Soviet assaults, often underprepared, which would grind down forces on both sides in one of the bloodiest series of battles of the entire war. Thus, the preconditions for the Rzhev battles combined strategic imperatives, political motivations, and military calculations. The Germans needed to hold the salient to maintain pressure on Moscow and protect Army Group Center. The Soviets aimed to eliminate the salient to secure the capital and achieve a decisive victory. Both sides were prepared for prolonged fighting, but neither fully grasped how drawn out and costly the struggle would become. What followed was more than a year of offensive and defensive operations, during which hundreds of thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured, leaving the region permanently scarred and earning its place in history as the unknown Stalingrad. The opening phase of the Rzhev battles began in January 1942, when the Soviet High Command sought to capitalize on the success of the winter counteroffensive that had driven the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow. The Soviet leadership believed that the German front was overstretched, exhausted by the failed attempt to capture the capital and vulnerable to decisive blows. Orders were issued for large-scale operations aimed at destroying Army Group Center by cutting off its salient around Rzhev, Vyazma, and Sychevka. The Kalinin Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, and the Western Front under General Georgy Zhukov were tasked with this mission. Together they fielded an estimated 1.1 million troops, supported by around 1,000 tanks and nearly 1,400 aircraft. The Germans, however, were not as weak as Soviet planners assumed. Army Group Center had pulled back from Moscow, but retained strong defensive positions around the Rzhev salient. The Ninth Army, commanded by Walter Model, controlled roughly 350,000 men, with more than a dozen infantry divisions, supported by panzer units and heavy artillery. Model had begun constructing elaborate defenses, including trench systems, barbed wire, minefields, and fortified villages. The salient itself, protruding toward Moscow, provided a defensive anchor and a potential launching point for future operations. German command understood its importance and was determined to hold it at all costs. In late January 1942, the Soviet offensive opened with ambitious plans. The 39th Army of the Kalinin Front advanced southward, aiming to cut the Rzhev-Vyazma rail line. Simultaneously, the 22nd Army struck from the north, and the 29th and 30th Armies sought to envelop German forces from the west. Zhukov's Western Front attacked from the east and southeast, with the 33rd, 5th, and 20th Armies driving directly at Vyazma. The intention was to encircle and destroy the German 9th Army in a vast pincer operation. Early Soviet advances achieved some tactical successes. In heavy snow and bitter cold, Soviet infantry penetrated German front lines, seizing villages and cutting communications. The 39th Army advanced nearly 100 kilometers deep into the German rear by early February, threatening supply lines and creating panic in some German units. Cavalry corps and airborne units were inserted to exploit breakthroughs, raiding behind German lines and disrupting logistics. For a time, it appeared that the Soviet plan might succeed in isolating major German forces. However, the rapid pace of the offensive soon faltered. Soviet units, advancing on foot through deep snow and without sufficient logistical support, began to exhaust their supplies. Fuel shortages stranded tanks and trucks, ammunition ran low, and food could not keep pace with the advancing troops. Meanwhile, the Germans, despite being outnumbered, used their defensive preparations effectively. Well-sighted machine guns, artillery fire, and counterattacks by panzer units inflicted heavy casualties. Model, who had just assumed command of the 9th Army in January, quickly proved his defensive skills, organizing flexible responses and moving reserves to threatened sectors. By February, the Soviet spearheads had become overextended. German counterattacks isolated parts of the 39th Army, cutting them off in the forests west of Rzhev. Air resupply proved inadequate, and Soviet airborne operations suffered devastating losses. German infantry and armor slowly stabilized the front, turning the Soviet penetrations into precarious salients of their own. Fighting around the villages of Olenino, Bely, and Zubtsov became especially intense, with both sides contesting control of frozen rivers and crossroads. The opening phase of the Rzhev campaign demonstrated the scale and intensity that would characterize the battles for more than a year. The Soviets committed immense manpower in an effort to destroy Army Group Center, while the Germans, though on the defensive, proved capable of withstanding massive assaults. Instead of a decisive breakthrough, the fighting devolved into a brutal war of attrition, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides in just the first 2 months. The meat grinder was already beginning to earn its grim name, setting the stage for repeated offensives and counteroffensives throughout 1942. The strategic goals and planning for the Rzhev campaign reflected both the ambition and miscalculations of the Soviet leadership, as well as the defensive resilience of the German command. In the aftermath of the successful defense of Moscow in December 1941, Stalin and the Stavka believed that the Wehrmacht was in a state of collapse. The Red Army was ordered to maintain unrelenting pressure along the entire front to prevent the Germans from regaining the initiative. Rzhev, located at a critical junction west of Moscow, became one of the focal points for this strategy. For the Soviets, the overarching objective was the destruction of Army Group Center. Specifically, Stalin aimed to eliminate the Ninth Army of Colonel General Walter Model, which occupied the Rzhev salient. This salient, extending toward Moscow, was viewed by the Soviets as both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because it brought German forces dangerously close to the capital, and an opportunity because it offered the potential for encirclement if Soviet armies could cut off its base near Vyazma and Smolensk. The immediate Soviet plan, beginning in January 1942, called for the Kalinin Front under General Ivan Konev and the Western Front under General Georgy Zhukov to conduct converging attacks on the salient from north and south. Their combined strength exceeded 1 million men, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and 1,400 aircraft. The operational design was ambitious. The Kalinin Front was to drive southward with its 39th and 22nd Armies to seize the Rzhev-Vyazma rail line, thereby severing the main supply artery of the German Ninth Army. Simultaneously, the Western Front would attack from the southeast with the 29th, 30th, 31st, and 33rd Armies pushing towards Sykivka and Vyazma. If successful, these offensives would encircle Model's entire force, trapping several 100,000 Germans west of Moscow. Complementary operations, including the use of airborne troops and cavalry corps, were planned to exploit breakthroughs and sow chaos in the German rear. The Soviet plans, however, rested on overly optimistic assumptions. Intelligence reports underestimated German reserves and the strength of their defensive positions. Soviet commanders also overestimated their own logistical capabilities. The offensives were launched in the dead of winter, across snow-covered forests and rivers, where movement was slow and supply convoys often could not keep up with advancing troops. Fuel and ammunition shortages soon emerged as a critical issue. Moreover, the Red Army, though growing in experience, had not yet mastered the coordination of large-scale combined arms offensives. Attacks were often poorly synchronized, with infantry advancing without adequate artillery or armor support. The Germans, for their part, had clear strategic goals centered on defense. After the failure to capture Moscow, Hitler issued orders that German forces must hold their positions at all costs. Withdrawal was forbidden except under direct authorization from the Führer himself. This meant that Model's Ninth Army was tasked with holding the Rzhev salient, regardless of the cost. Model, recognized as a master of defensive warfare, set about transforming the salient into a fortified bastion. Over the course of early 1942, German troops constructed extensive trench networks, dugouts, and strongpoints. Defensive belts were created with minefields and interlocking fields of fire. Villages and towns such as Rzhev, Olenino, and Sykivka were converted into fortified strongholds with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements. German doctrine emphasized flexible defense. Model deployed his divisions not in rigid lines but in depth, ensuring that Soviet breakthroughs could be contained by counterattacks. Mobile reserves, including panzer divisions, were kept ready to strike at Soviet spearheads. The Luftwaffe, though stretched across the vast Eastern Front, provided crucial support by targeting Soviet supply columns, striking troop concentrations, and maintaining air superiority in key sectors. German logistics, while strained, benefited from control of the rail network in the region, allowing for relatively rapid movement of reinforcements. Propaganda and political considerations influenced planning on both sides. Stalin demanded relentless offensives, partly to maintain Allied confidence and demonstrate Soviet determination. Soviet propaganda emphasized the liberation of Russian soil and the expulsion of the invader, raising expectations of quick victories. German propaganda, on the other hand, portrayed the defense of Rzhev as proof of the Wehrmacht's endurance after the setback at Moscow. For Hitler, holding the salient was politically important. Abandoning it would have signaled weakness at a time when he sought to maintain the image of German invincibility. The consequences of these strategic goals and plans were immense. The Soviets launched repeated offensives throughout 1942, including the Rzhev operations in January, April, and later operations in summer and autumn. Each was intended to encircle and destroy Model's Ninth Army. None achieved their grand objectives, but all inflicted and sustained enormous casualties. The Germans, while successfully holding the salient, paid heavily in manpower and resources, fighting defensive battles in brutal conditions for over a year. In retrospect, the planning revealed deep contrasts. The Soviets pursued ambitious encirclement schemes, but lacked the logistical and tactical capacity to achieve them fully in 1942. Their reliance on sheer manpower and determination resulted in high casualties for limited territorial gains. The Germans, constrained by Hitler's insistence on holding ground, turned Rzhev into a fortress at the cost of immense losses and strategic flexibility. Both sides were locked into a cycle of attack and counterattack that transformed the salient into one of the bloodiest sectors of the entire Eastern Front. Thus, the strategic goals and planning of the Rzhev campaign set the stage for its character, a drawn-out, attritional struggle marked by repeated Soviet offensives and determined German defense. The ambitions of both sides collided with the realities of terrain, weather, logistics, and command decisions, producing a campaign that neither side could decisively win, but which consumed hundreds of thousands of lives in the process. The first major clashes of the Rzhev campaign unfolded during the winter and spring of 1942. After the opening Soviet offensives in January, which sought to encircle the German Ninth Army and sever its communications with Vyazma, the fighting quickly devolved into a grinding contest of attrition. The initial shock of the Red Army's counteroffensive, launched in snow and sub-zero temperatures, achieved deep penetrations in some areas, but German defenses stiffened, and what followed were months of bloody engagements across forests, rivers, and fortified villages. One of the most dramatic actions occurred when the Soviet 39th Army, advancing south from the Kalinin Front, broke through German lines and pushed nearly 100 kilometers into the rear of the Ninth Army. Cavalry corps and airborne troops were deployed to exploit the advance, striking rail lines and attempting to cut supply routes. By mid-February, Soviet units were threatening the communications around Sychevka and even posed a danger of encircling Rzhev itself. However, the advance soon became overextended. Supply convoys could not reach forward positions across the snowbound terrain, and the troops ran short of fuel and ammunition. German counterattacks, supported by mobile reserves and the Luftwaffe, gradually isolated the spearhead. By March, large portions of the 39th Army were themselves surrounded and reduced, their offensive potential eliminated. Elsewhere along the salient, Soviet armies clashed with entrenched German defenders in repeated assaults. The 29th, 30th, and 31st Armies attacked the southern and eastern sectors, aiming to break through to Vyazma. Fighting around the towns of Olenino, Bely, and Zubtsov was especially intense. German troops, often dug into multiple defensive belts, used minefields, bunkers, and artillery fire to blunt Soviet advances. Whenever a breakthrough seemed imminent, Model deployed his panzer divisions to launch immediate counterattacks, restoring the front line. The Luftwaffe played a decisive role in these engagements, bombing Soviet concentrations and cutting off attempts at coordination. Casualties mounted rapidly. By the end of March 1942, Soviet losses in killed, wounded, and missing numbered well over 250,000, with entire divisions reduced to a fraction of their original strength. German losses were significantly lower but still heavy, estimated at 40,000–60,000 men in the Ninth Army during the same period. The disparity reflected the tactical advantage of defense in prepared positions, but the cost for both sides was already immense. For the Soviets, the determination to press forward despite setbacks reflected Stalin's insistence on maintaining pressure. For the Germans, the need to hold Rzhev justified absorbing casualties that strained their manpower reserves. Civilian populations in the Rzhev region were caught directly in these clashes. Villages were destroyed by artillery bombardments or burned in fighting. Civilians often found themselves in the crossfire or forcibly displaced. German occupation authorities requisitioned food and labor, while Soviet partisans sought support from locals to carry out sabotage against German rail lines and depots. The presence of civilians complicated both sides' operations, as villages provided cover for ambushes but also became targets for reprisals. Unexpected turning points occurred during this phase. In March 1942, German counterattacks succeeded in cutting off large Soviet forces, including much of the 33rd Army, which had advanced deep into the German rear during the winter offensive. Encircled near Vyazma, parts of this army were annihilated, with thousands of men killed or captured. This failure demonstrated the difficulty the Red Army faced in coordinating large encirclement operations. At the same time, the Germans, though successful in eliminating the threat, could not push the Soviets back significantly farther west. The salient remained contested, and both sides prepared for further clashes. By spring, the Rzhev front had stabilized into a bloody stalemate. Soviet offensives had failed to achieve the encirclement of the Ninth Army, but had forced the Germans into a defensive posture that demanded constant vigilance. The Germans had proven capable of holding the salient, but at the cost of exhausting their troops and resources in daily battles. Soviet armies remained deployed in strength around the salient, launching constant local attacks and probing actions. The result was a front that consumed manpower and material at a relentless rate, with no decisive outcome in sight. The first engagements of the Rzhev campaign thus revealed the essential character of the Meatgrinder. The Red Army was willing to expend vast numbers of men in repeated offensives, seeking to eliminate a salient that threatened Moscow. The Wehrmacht, under Model's command, demonstrated skill in defense and counterattack, using terrain, fortifications, and mobility to inflict heavy losses. Neither side achieved its broader aims, but both became locked into a cycle of attack and attrition that would continue through 1942. The cost was already staggering in human terms, and yet the battles for Rzhev were only beginning. As spring turned to summer, both sides re-evaluated their positions. The Soviets planned new offensives with more preparation, hoping to correct earlier mistakes. The Germans fortified their lines further, determined to hold the salient as a symbol of resilience after the failure before Moscow. The stage was set for the escalation of one of the most protracted and costly struggles on the Eastern Front, a campaign that would come to be remembered by soldiers on both sides as one of the most brutal of the entire war. The escalation of the Rzhev campaign took place through the spring and summer of 1942, when both the Soviet and German commands reinforced the salient and committed themselves to a prolonged struggle. What had begun as a winter counteroffensive evolved into a grinding war of attrition in which hundreds of thousands of soldiers were consumed in battles that rarely changed the front lines significantly. The Soviets sought to eliminate the salient through repeated offensives, while the Germans, determined to hold their ground, poured men and materiel into fortifications and counterattacks. The result was one of the most sustained and bloody deadlocks of the entire Eastern Front. After the failure of the initial Soviet encirclement attempts in February and March 1942, Stalin and the Stavka refused to abandon the objective. The Rzhev salient was seen as an intolerable threat to Moscow, projecting German power only 200 kilometers from the capital. Orders were issued for renewed offensives to reduce the salient and destroy Model's Ninth Army. Reinforcements were shifted to the Kalinin and Western fronts, while formations mauled in earlier battles were replenished with new recruits, often poorly trained but committed to the task. By summer, Soviet forces opposite the salient again numbered over 1 million men, with approximately 1,500 tanks and more than 1,000 aircraft. The Germans responded by transforming the salient into one of the most heavily fortified sectors on the Eastern Front. Under Model's direction, the Ninth Army constructed multiple defensive belts up to 20 kilometers deep. These included trenches, anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and minefields. Villages were turned into strongpoints, with stone houses reinforced for machine gun and sniper positions. Artillery was carefully sighted to cover likely avenues of Soviet advance. The Germans also made extensive use of camouflage and deception, hiding reserves in forests until they could be unleashed in counterattacks. Their forces in the salient numbered around 350,000 men, supported by 500 tanks and assault guns and nearly 700 aircraft from Luftflotte 2. The Soviets launched a series of renewed assaults in July and August, collectively known as Operation Seydlitz and the first Rzhev offensive operation. The attacks were massive in scale, involving the 30th, 31st, and 20th Armies of the Western Front, supported by the 29th and 39th Armies of the Kalinin Front. The objective was to break through the eastern side of the salient and advance on Sychevka, thereby cutting off Rzhev. Soviet artillery barrages opened the offensives with thousands of shells, but the German defenses absorbed the bombardment. When Soviet infantry and tanks advanced, they were met by minefields, pre-sighted artillery, and withering small arms fire. German countermeasures were immediate. Panzer divisions, including the 5th and 12th Panzer, were committed to blunt Soviet penetrations. Air support from Stuka dive bombers inflicted heavy losses on Soviet armor, while German infantry, fighting from fortified positions, repelled repeated assaults. The Soviets managed to seize some forward trenches and villages, but progress was minimal compared to the cost. By mid-August, after weeks of relentless attacks, Soviet forces had advanced only a few kilometers, while suffering more than 180,000 casualties in killed, wounded, and missing. German losses, though far smaller, still numbered tens of thousands, straining the reserves of the Ninth Army. The escalation phase was marked by the intensity and relentlessness of combat. Villages changed hands multiple times, often reduced to rubble in the process. Forests became killing fields, where infantry battles raged at close quarters. Rivers such as the Vazuza and the Osuga were contested crossing points, where Soviet troops attempted to force bridges under constant artillery fire. Civilians in the area endured bombardments, requisitions, and reprisals, with many villages depopulated entirely by the fighting. One of the most notable episodes occurred during Operation Seydlitz in July 1942, when German forces themselves launched a counteroffensive to eliminate Soviet penetrations west of Rzhev. The Ninth Army encircled elements of the Soviet 39th Army and the 11th Cavalry Corps, trapping approximately 25,000 men. Over several days of fighting, these Soviet units were destroyed or captured, further highlighting the vulnerability of Soviet deep penetrations without adequate supply lines. For the Red Army, the escalation of the campaign was demoralizing. Repeated offensives failed to achieve their goals, and losses mounted to unsustainable levels. Entire divisions were reduced to a few hundred men, while newly arrived recruits were often thrown into battle with little preparation. Yet the Soviet High Command continued to order fresh attacks, convinced that attrition would eventually wear down the German defenses. The German side, meanwhile, recognized that although they were holding the line, the continuous pressure drained manpower and resources at an alarming rate. Model's defensive doctrine was effective, but it relied on constant reinforcement and expenditure of ammunition, fuel, and aircraft sorties. The international dimension of the escalation was also significant. The Soviet Union's Western allies were pressing for the opening of a second front in Europe in 1942, something which had not materialized. Soviet leaders pointed to battles like Rzhev as evidence of the enormous strain the Red Army was enduring alone. German propaganda, conversely, emphasized their success in holding firm, presenting Rzhev as proof that the Wehrmacht remained strong despite the failure to capture Moscow. By September 1942, the escalation had reached a crisis point for both sides. The Soviets had launched multiple large-scale offensives, expending hundreds of thousands of men and vast quantities of equipment, with little to show but incremental territorial gains. The Germans had held the salient, but at a cost that strained their ability to maintain strong forces across the entire front, particularly as attention and resources were increasingly diverted to the southern sector and the unfolding battle at Stalingrad. The escalation of the Rzhev campaign thus cemented its character as a meat grinder. It was not a single battle, but a series of offensives and counteroffensives that consumed resources on a colossal scale. Neither side achieved decisive breakthroughs, but both suffered enormous casualties. For the Red Army, the determination to eliminate the salient led to repeated costly attacks. For the Wehrmacht, the insistence on holding it drained divisions that might have been decisive elsewhere. The consequences of this escalation would shape the later phases of the campaign and contribute to the larger dynamics of the Eastern Front. The peak of the Rzhev campaign unfolded in the late summer and autumn of 1942, when the Soviets launched their largest effort yet to crush the German Ninth Army. Known as the Second Rzhev-Sishevka Offensive Operation, or Operation Mars, this assault began in late November 1942 under the direct oversight of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. At its height, it represented one of the most ambitious Soviet undertakings of the war to that date, involving nearly 700,000 troops, over 2,000 tanks, 15,000 artillery pieces, and close to 1,000 aircraft. The aim was nothing less than the destruction of Model's entire Ninth Army, estimated at 350,000 men, through multiple concentric attacks designed to encircle and annihilate the German force holding the salient. The Soviet plan envisioned four major thrusts. The Kalinin Front under Colonel General Maxim Purkayev would attack from the north with its 39th and 22nd Armies, supported by Tank Corps, to cut off German positions around Bailey and Olenino. Simultaneously, the Western Front under Colonel General Ivan Konev would strike from the east with the 20th, 31st, 29th, and 30th Armies, pushing across the Vazuza River toward Sichevka and Rzhev itself. Tank corps and mechanized units were intended to exploit breakthroughs, encircle German divisions, and collapse the entire salient in a decisive operation. The opening artillery barrages in late November were among the heaviest of the Eastern Front up to that point. Thousands of guns thundered against German trenches, followed by massed tank assaults and waves of infantry. In some sectors, Soviet units achieved rapid progress. The 41st Army, supported by the 1st Mechanized Corps, broke through German lines near Bely and advanced as much as 25 kilometers, threatening to envelop German formations. In the south, the 20th Army crossed the Vazuza River and created bridgeheads under heavy fire. For a moment, Soviet commanders believed the operation might achieve its objectives, but the German defenses, designed in depth and commanded by Walter Model, absorbed the shock. Villages like Bely, Sichevka, and Olenino became focal points of resistance, with German troops fighting from fortified houses, bunkers, and trenches. The 5th and 12th Panzer Divisions, held in reserve, were thrown into counterattacks that blunted Soviet armor. Stuka dive bombers struck concentrations of tanks, while German artillery, carefully pre-sighted, broke up Soviet infantry assaults. The dense forests and swampy terrain limited maneuver, funneling Soviet forces into kill zones, where their numerical advantage was offset by the terrain and German defensive preparations. By early December, the offensives bogged down. Soviet spearheads found themselves isolated and surrounded by counterattacking German divisions. At Bely, entire Soviet mechanized corps were encircled, with thousands of men killed or captured and hundreds of tanks destroyed. Near the Vazuza River, Soviet bridgeheads were reduced by relentless German fire, and repeated attempts to expand them failed. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Soviet records suggest losses of 335,000 men, including killed, wounded, and missing in Operation Mars, along with more than 1,500 tanks destroyed or abandoned. German losses, while far lower, still reached an estimated 40,000–50,000, straining the Ninth Army. The peak of the campaign also had a wider context. While Operation Mars raged around Rzhev, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus at Stalingrad, encircling the German Sixth Army in November 1942. Some historians later argued that Operation Mars was intended as a diversion to pin down German reserves at Rzhev, while Stalingrad became the main focus. Soviet documents, however, reveal that Mars was intended as a major offensive in its own right, designed to destroy Army Group Center's northern flank. Its failure contrasted sharply with the simultaneous triumph at Stalingrad, leading to its minimization in post-war Soviet historiography. For the soldiers, the peak of the Rzhev battles was a nightmare of attrition. Accounts from both sides describe forests filled with wrecked tanks, frozen corpses, and shattered villages. Bitter cold compounded the misery, with temperatures dropping below -20 degrees Celsius. Ammunition ran low, medical evacuation was often impossible, and wounded men froze to death on the battlefield. German defenders endured constant bombardments and waves of attacks, while Soviet attackers suffered horrendous casualties in repeated assaults against entrenched positions. Civilians in the region were caught in the middle of the inferno. Villages were destroyed, populations displaced, and survivors subjected to occupation policies or forced labor. Many civilians perished in the crossfire or from hunger and exposure after their homes were burned. The peak of the Rzhev campaign thus inflicted devastation not only on the armies but also on the local population, leaving scars that lasted long after the front moved westward. By the end of December 1942, Operation Mars was effectively over. The Soviets had failed to eliminate the Rzhev salient, suffering catastrophic losses for minimal territorial gains. The Germans had once again demonstrated the effectiveness of their defensive tactics under Model's leadership, but at the cost of exhausting divisions that could not be easily replaced. The peak of the campaign cemented Rzhev's reputation as one of the most costly and brutal theaters of the war, earning its grim label as the Meatgrinder. Neither side achieved decisive victory, but both paid an enormous price that would shape the next phase of the struggle into 1943. Resistance and adaptation defined the Rzhev front in the aftermath of Operation Mars, when both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht confronted the realities of exhaustion and attrition. The winter of 1942-43 forced adjustments in strategy, tactics, and even psychology, as soldiers and commanders struggled to continue fighting in what had become one of the deadliest sectors of the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, repeated failures demanded reassessment. Zhukov and the Stavka recognized that frontal assaults against fortified positions cost hundreds of thousands of lives without decisive results. Nevertheless, the strategic need to eliminate the Rzhev salient remained. Soviet units therefore experimented with improved coordination of artillery, infantry, and armor. Greater emphasis was placed on concentrated fire support rather than broad, shallow attacks across wide fronts. Engineers worked to develop more efficient methods of breaching minefields and fortifications, while supply services reorganized to improve the flow of ammunition and rations through forests and swamps. Despite these innovations, deficiencies remained. Shortages of radios limited communication, and inexperienced recruits still made up much of the replacement pool. Resistance took many forms on the German side as well. The Ninth Army, under Model, had endured months of constant pressure. Its divisions, often reduced to half their authorized strength, relied increasingly on defensive ingenuity. German troops adapted by turning terrain into weapons. Frozen rivers were fortified with blockhouses and wire, forests mined extensively, and destroyed villages converted into strongpoints. Model emphasized elastic defense, encouraging local commanders to yield ground temporarily and then counterattack to restore positions. This flexibility helped preserve the front, though it demanded high levels of discipline and morale among troops facing endless assaults. Partisan activity intensified behind the German lines during this period. Soviet partisan detachments, supplied by air and reinforced by escaped soldiers, struck at German railways, bridges, and supply depots. These actions disrupted logistics, delayed reinforcements, and forced the diversion of German units to security duties. In response, German forces conducted harsh anti-partisan sweeps, which often inflicted heavy civilian casualties and deepened local suffering. This cycle of resistance and repression added another layer of brutality to the already deadly front. The psychological toll on both armies was severe. For Soviet soldiers, the Rzhev front became synonymous with futility. Men went into repeated offensives with little expectation of survival. Letters and diaries describe units reduced to a fraction of their original strength within days, commanders replaced several times in the same month, and landscapes littered with wreckage and corpses. For Germans, the unrelenting pressure and the knowledge that relief or rotation was unlikely fostered a grim determination, but also exhaustion and fatalism. Divisions cycled in and out of the salient often returned at half strength, with few replacements forthcoming. Adaptation also extended to broader strategy. By early 1943, the Soviet High Command began planning to use deception, better timing, and coordinated fronts to achieve results. Rather than relying solely on massed frontal attacks, they sought opportunities to fix German forces with feints while concentrating decisive strength elsewhere. This thinking would later underpin successful operations like the encirclement at Stalingrad and later Kursk, though Rzhev remained a testing ground. For the Germans, holding the salient was becoming increasingly unsustainable. Though Hitler remained adamant that no ground be abandoned, many officers recognized that the cost of defending the Bulge outweighed its benefits. Army Group Center devoted disproportionate resources to holding the line at Rzhev, weakening its ability to support operations elsewhere. Supplies were strained, and with the growing threat of Soviet offensives across the front, questions arose within the German command about whether the salient could be held indefinitely. Thus, the period following Operation Mars was characterized by resistance, improvisation, and a growing awareness on both sides that attrition alone was not sustainable. The Soviets sought to adapt their methods, the Germans relied on defensive innovation, and both endured enormous psychological strain. The Rzhev salient remained intact, but the struggle was far from over, and the seeds of its eventual abandonment were already being sown. The turning point of the Rzhev campaign came in early 1943, when the strategic balance on the Eastern Front shifted dramatically. Although the battles around Rzhev had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, the broader context of the war forced both sides to reevaluate their positions. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in November 1942 and its surrender in February 1943 created an entirely new situation. The Red Army, having delivered its first decisive strategic victory of the war, now had the initiative. The German High Command, reeling from the loss of more than 250,000 men in the south, could no longer justify tying down massive forces in the Rzhev salient. What had once been considered an indispensable position threatening Moscow now appeared as a dangerous liability. For the Soviets, the turning point lay in the combination of military experience gained at Rzhev and the confidence derived from Stalingrad. The Red Army had failed to eliminate the salient despite multiple offensives in 1942, but it had learned lessons in combined arms coordination, logistical planning, and the necessity of concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points. By early 1943, Soviet commanders understood that a frontal reduction of the salient might not be necessary if German forces could be compelled to abandon it under pressure elsewhere. Stavka directed attention towards simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts, including operations in the southern sector that would eventually culminate in the Battle of Kursk. At the same time, preparations continued for new offensives against Army Group Center, designed to exploit any weakness if the Germans chose to hold their advanced positions around Rzhev. The Germans, however, recognized the strategic danger of maintaining the salient. It extended deep into Soviet-held territory, vulnerable to encirclement from the north and south. Defending it consumed disproportionate resources. Model's Ninth Army, numbering nearly 350,000 men with more than a dozen divisions, had to hold a bulge that demanded extensive fortifications, long supply lines, and constant reinforcement. After Stalingrad, Hitler reluctantly accepted recommendations from the Army High Command, OKH, to withdraw from the salient to shorten the front and free divisions for other sectors. Operation Büffel, the planned evacuation of the Rzhev salient, was scheduled for March 1943. The decision to withdraw represented the real turning point of the campaign. For over a year, the salient had symbolized German resilience after the failure at Moscow. Its fortifications, trenches, and strongpoints had withstood repeated Soviet offensives. Now, abandoning it conceded not only the physical ground, but also the symbolic value of holding a position so close to the Soviet capital. Hitler justified the withdrawal as a measure to consolidate lines and prepare for future offensives, but for many German soldiers, it was seen as recognition that the strategic initiative had been lost. The execution of Operation Büffel illustrated the thoroughness of German planning and the brutality of scorched earth policies. Beginning in early March 1943, German forces methodically evacuated their positions, destroying anything that might be of use to the Soviets. Rail lines, bridges, and depots were blown up. Villages were burned, food supplies confiscated, and thousands of civilians were deported as forced laborers. Mines and booby traps were left behind in massive numbers, creating deadly hazards for advancing Soviet troops. In military terms, the withdrawal was carried out skillfully, with German rearguards preventing Soviet forces from encircling or inflicting major losses on the retreating divisions. By the end of March, the salient had been completely evacuated, and the front line was shortened by nearly 100 kilometers. For the Soviets, the turning point was received with mixed feelings. On one hand, the Red Army had finally achieved its goal of eliminating the Rzhev salient. The enemy was forced to abandon a position that had consumed Soviet lives in immense numbers. On the other hand, the Germans had denied the Soviets the decisive victory they had sought. The withdrawal was orderly, and most German divisions escaped intact to fight another day. The Soviets gained territory, but not the destruction of enemy forces that might have equaled Stalingrad in significance. Still, the elimination of the salient removed the immediate threat to Moscow and freed Soviet forces for future operations. For the soldiers who had fought in the Meatgrinder, the turning point was experienced in human rather than strategic terms. Survivors of Soviet divisions that had assaulted the salient throughout 1942 now advanced into devastated landscapes, finding villages burned to the ground, forests littered with mines, and rivers choked with wreckage. German soldiers, many of whom had endured the brutal defensive battles of the previous year, marched westward, leaving behind comrades buried in trenches and fields. Both sides recognized that something immense had ended. A struggle that had drained strength without producing decisive victory had finally concluded, not by conquest, but by evacuation. The repercussions of the turning point extended beyond the battlefield. For the Soviets, the elimination of the Rzhev salient strengthened the narrative that the Red Army was now capable of forcing the enemy back on all fronts. It provided a morale boost to both soldiers and civilians, reinforcing the sense that the tide of war had shifted irreversibly. For the Germans, the retreat marked the beginning of a series of strategic withdrawals that would continue through 1943 and 1944. Even as they prepared for a renewed offensive at Kursk, the Wehrmacht could no longer disguise the reality that its hold on occupied Soviet territory was being steadily eroded. In retrospect, the turning point of the Rzhev campaign was not defined by a single battle or breakthrough, but by the decision to abandon the salient itself. After more than a year of savage fighting, the Germans conceded that the position could not be held indefinitely. The Soviet Union gained both territory and strategic security, while Germany lost one of its last footholds near Moscow. The campaign had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, but its outcome symbolized the broader transformation of the Eastern Front. From German initiative and offensives in 1941 to Soviet resilience in 1942, and finally to Soviet ascendancy in 1943. The aftermath of the Rzhev campaign was as devastating as the battles themselves. By the time Operation Büffel concluded in March 1943, the salient that had once threatened Moscow was gone, and both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were left to grapple with the consequences of a year-long attritional struggle that had cost them hundreds of thousands of men. The scale of the human and material toll, the immediate impact on civilian populations, and the shifting strategic picture together defined the outcome of what became one of the least remembered, yet most costly campaigns of the Second World War. For the Wehrmacht, the withdrawal from the Rzhev salient was carried out in a disciplined and organized fashion. Model's Ninth Army, reduced but still intact, fell back to new positions along the Smolensk-Vyazma line. In military terms, the operation was a tactical success. More than 300,000 men withdrew with most of their heavy equipment, avoiding the encirclement that Soviet planners had hoped to inflict. Yet the retreat had broader consequences. Abandoning the salient represented an admission that the Germans could no longer maintain advanced positions close to Moscow. It marked the end of any realistic prospect of renewing the offensive against the Soviet capital, a goal that had driven German strategy since the summer of 1941. The scorched earth policies applied during Operation Buffel left a deep scar on the region. German engineers destroyed infrastructure systematically, demolishing railways, blowing up bridges, and burning storage facilities. Villages were emptied, their populations forcibly deported or left to starve. Tens of thousands of civilians were sent westward as forced laborers. Others perished during reprisals against suspected partisan support. Mines, booby traps, and hidden charges were left in houses, wells, and fields, causing casualties long after the front moved on. When Soviet troops advanced into the vacated territory, they found a devastated landscape, destroyed settlements, poisoned wells, and forests seeded with explosives. For the Red Army, the immediate aftermath was one of mixed achievement. On the one hand, the elimination of the Rzhev salient was a long-awaited success. The Germans had been compelled to abandon a position that had consumed vast Soviet resources in 1942. The symbolic importance of removing the direct threat to Moscow could not be overstated. On the other hand, the Soviets had not destroyed the German Ninth Army, as they had the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Instead, their opponent had withdrawn intact, ready to fight again in the defensive battles of 1943. The Soviet forces advancing into the abandoned salient gained territory, but not the decisive victory they had sought at such high cost. The casualty figures remain among the most striking features of the aftermath. Over the course of the Rzhev battles from January 1942 to March 1943, Soviet losses are estimated at more than 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. German losses, though far smaller, were still severe, estimated at between 300,000 and 400,000 over the same period. These figures placed the campaign among the bloodiest of the war, rivaling or even surpassing Stalingrad in total losses, though without the clear outcome that made Stalingrad a turning point. The result was a campaign remembered by Soviet veterans as a meat grinder, a place where entire divisions vanished without achieving decisive breakthroughs. For civilians, the aftermath meant continued suffering under occupation or displacement. Those who had survived the battles and the German scorched earth withdrawal returned to ruins. Food stocks were gone, livestock slaughtered or driven away, and homes burned. Rebuilding life in the devastated region proved difficult even after the front moved westward. Many survivors carried memories of forced labor, deportations, or massacres that shaped the post-war population of the area. The psychological scars of living for more than a year in the middle of one of the war's bloodiest campaigns left a lasting imprint. The strategic implications for both sides were profound. For the Soviets, the elimination of the salient simplified the front lines and freed forces for future operations. The Red Army could now concentrate more resources on the central and southern sectors, where upcoming battles at Kursk and in Ukraine would determine the future course of the war. The costly experience at Rzhev also forced the Soviet command to refine operational planning, logistics, and combined arms tactics, lessons that would be applied with greater success in later offensives. For the Germans, the aftermath of Rzhev demonstrated the limits of defensive warfare. Model's skillful defense had preserved the Ninth Army, but at immense cost. The attritional struggle drained manpower and resources that might have been decisive elsewhere. Moreover, the decision to withdraw revealed the strategic dilemma facing the Wehrmacht. Every salient held against relentless Soviet pressure risked becoming a trap, but abandoning them ceded ground and eroded confidence. By early 1943, German forces were already preparing for the next major confrontation at Kursk, where they hoped to regain the initiative. The shadow of Rzhev loomed over those plans, reminding commanders of the enormous costs of prolonged attrition. Internationally, the Rzhev battles received little attention at the time. Western allies focused on Stalingrad as the symbol of Soviet resilience and turning fortunes on the Eastern Front. Soviet propaganda itself minimized the failures at Rzhev, emphasizing instead the eventual withdrawal of the Germans as proof of Red Army determination. Post-war memory followed a similar pattern. While Stalingrad and Kursk became central to Soviet historical narratives, Rzhev remained largely forgotten, despite the scale of its losses. Among veterans, however, the memory of the unknown Stalingrad endured, a term that captured both the bloodshed and the neglect of official recognition. The immediate aftermath of the campaign thus combined devastation on the ground with a strategic rebalancing of the war. The Red Army gained security for Moscow and valuable lessons for future offensives, while the Wehrmacht lost one of its last forward positions near the Soviet capital and suffered irretrievable attrition. Civilians endured the destruction of their homes and livelihoods, and the region bore scars that would last for generations. The Rzhev Meatgrinder ended not with a decisive battle, but with a retreat that underscored the changing tide of the war. Its aftermath revealed the true cost of attrition and highlighted the shift from German initiative to Soviet ascendancy on the Eastern Front. The legacy and historical significance of the Rzhev battles extend far beyond the immediate outcome of the campaign. Although overshadowed by Stalingrad and Kursk in official narratives, the fighting around Rzhev between January 1942 and March 1943 shaped the course of the Eastern Front in ways that continue to be re-evaluated by historians. Its reputation as the unknown Stalingrad reflects both the scale of the losses and the relative neglect it received in public memory. To understand its importance, one must consider the long-term military, political, and cultural consequences. Militarily, the Rzhev campaign demonstrated the enormous costs of attrition warfare. For over a year, the Red Army launched repeated offensives against a salient that the Wehrmacht was determined to hold. The result was more than 1 million Soviet casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, compared to approximately 350,000–400,000 German losses. These figures underline the imbalance between Soviet determination and the effectiveness of German defensive tactics under Walter Model. Yet the losses, though catastrophic, provided the Red Army with hard-won experience in planning, coordinating, and sustaining major operations. The failures at Rzhev forced Soviet commanders to refine logistics, artillery preparation, and the integration of armor and infantry. By 1943, these lessons contributed directly to the improved operational skill displayed at Kursk and in later offensives. For the Germans, Rzhev marked the high point of their ability to conduct prolonged defensive operations in the east. Model's elastic defense, reliance on fortifications, and use of mobile reserves showed that the Wehrmacht could hold large salients for extended periods. However, the cost of holding Rzhev was unsustainable. German divisions suffered continuous losses that could not be fully replaced. By abandoning the salient in Operation Büffel, the Wehrmacht effectively acknowledged that it lacked the reserves to defend every forward position. The retreat foreshadowed later strategic withdrawals in 1943 and 1944, as German forces increasingly fought a defensive war across the Eastern Front. The political consequences were significant as well. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, the inability to destroy the Ninth Army outright was a source of frustration, especially since the losses rivaled or exceeded those at Stalingrad. Soviet propaganda emphasized the eventual liberation of Rzhev and the elimination of the salient, but the narrative downplayed the repeated failures and immense casualties. After the war, official histories often avoided detailed discussion of Rzhev, focusing instead on more clear-cut victories. This contributed to its reputation as a forgotten battle, remembered vividly by veterans, but largely absent from official commemoration until decades later. In Germany, The defense of Rzhev was portrayed as a testament to the endurance of the Wehrmacht. Nazi propaganda highlighted the ability of German soldiers to withstand massive Soviet assaults, presenting the salient as evidence of resilience after the setback before Moscow. Yet the eventual evacuation undercut this narrative. While Hitler tried to justify the withdrawal as a strategic redeployment, the loss of the salient marked another step in the gradual erosion of German confidence in ultimate victory. Civilians who lived in the Rzhev region bore lasting scars from the campaign. Entire villages were destroyed, populations deported, and survivors subjected to scorched earth tactics during the German retreat. Post-war reconstruction was slow, and memories of forced labor, reprisals, and famine endured in local communities. For many, the Rzhev campaign symbolized the indiscriminate destruction of total war, where civilian and military suffering merged into a single landscape of devastation. In historiographical terms, the Rzhev battles highlight the complexity of evaluating victory and defeat. The Soviets eventually reclaimed the territory, but only after enduring immense losses. The Germans held their positions for more than a year, but at the cost of weakening their overall strategic posture. Neither side could claim decisive triumph. Instead, Rzhev epitomized the attritional nature of the Eastern Front, where battles often consumed vast resources without producing quick or dramatic results. The memory of Rzhev gradually resurfaced after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when previously restricted archives became available. Historians began to reassess the scale of the campaign, comparing it to Stalingrad and emphasizing its importance in shaping the Red Army's operational development. Monuments and memorials were established in the Rzhev region to honor the fallen, and veterans' accounts helped preserve the reality of the campaign for future generations. The Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet Soldier, unveiled in 2020, symbolized this process of recognition, bringing public attention to a battle long neglected in official narratives. In broader cultural terms, Rzhev represents the paradox of war memory. Stalingrad and Kursk became synonymous with Soviet victory and resilience, celebrated in literature, film, and official commemorations. Rzhev, by contrast, embodied the grim costs of war without the clarity of triumph. This absence from popular memory underscores how societies often remember wars through symbols of victory rather than attrition. Yet for those who fought and lived through the campaign, Rzhev was as significant as any other battle, a crucible that tested endurance, resilience, and the limits of human survival. Ultimately, the historical significance of the Rzhev Meatgrinder lies in its dual legacy. On the one hand, it exposed the limitations of both Soviet and German strategy in 1942, when neither side could deliver a decisive blow. On the other hand, it marked the transition to a new phase of the war, where the Red Army's growing strength and Germany's declining reserves began to reshape the balance of power. The campaign did not end in dramatic encirclement or surrender, but in a calculated withdrawal that reflected the changing tide of the Eastern Front. In its aftermath, the Soviet Union gained the initiative it would never again lose, while Germany began the long retreat that would end in Berlin. The Rzhev battles remain less famous than Stalingrad, yet their legacy is immense. They demonstrate the true nature of the war on the Eastern Front, a conflict of attrition, endurance, and adaptation, where victory was often measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in the survival of armies and the slow shifting of strategic momentum. The men and women who endured Rzhev bore witness to one of the most costly and brutal campaigns of the Second World War, a struggle whose lessons and consequences shaped the course of the war and the memory of an entire generation.